So let me welcome everybody to year's defense. So he is a student that joined my lab as a very young student. So we graduated very young. I think, how old were you? Like 18 or something like that when you joined?
Yeah.
But nevertheless, he's been a very, mature student. You got interested in this question of bias in computer vision, actually in an area where at the time when still not a lot of people were working on this. Since then, it has become a lot more um, popular. Today we're gonna see still see sort of like tour de force in this area, quite well integrated and like, unlike many other students that just like, publish a bunch of papers, is one of those students that is since the beginning we sort of interested in the topic and kind of like pursue it and at great depth. And I think we're going to see that today. Okay, so we just please go ahead.
Right. Thanks, Noah, for the introduction. So, by the way, can all of you see the screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. So, yeah, as Noah introduced, so the topic of my defense is holistic bias mitigation in computer vision and beyond. So, I'll get straight in. So in the past decade, we have witnessed a revolution in computer vision driven by deep learning, where we have generations and after generations of architectures from ConvNets to transformers being introduced. And these deep models enabled us to advance the state of the art on classic vision problems like image recognition, video recognition, but also explore new paradigms in multimodal learning and generative modeling. So there is I would say, a clear trend in the evolution of vision in the deep learning era, which is scaling. Throughout the past decade, researchers and the industry have been constantly pushing the limits of computations to train larger and larger vision models on more and more data. So is training models on gigantic data the ultimate solution to computer vision, or are there problems that cannot be solved simply through scaling? Now, one feature that made deep neural networks so successful is that they're good at fitting distributions given enough data, exploiting all the cues as they can, even subtle cues that are difficult for human to recognize. However, oftentimes there may be artifacts in the training distribution in a way that they deviate in certain ways from the real ground truth distribution of the task. So there are two modes of such artifacts, I would say. There's imbalance where particular groups of examples are underrepresented compared to others. And there is spurious correlation where the target labels can be leaked through some hidden dimensions or irrelevant features. And exactly because the neural nets are so good at learning representations and optimizing on distributions, the features they learned can overfit to these artifacts and fall apart when tested on the real unseen data. So this phenomenon is known as a distribution shift or dataset shift, and it serves as a foundation for understanding all bias and fairness problems in machine learning. So because overfitting here happens on the distribution and not sample level, simply collecting more data points in an IID manner would not keep the bias away, meaning that even larger scaled models can be biased. And I will show examples in the rest of these throughout the talk. So people have been studying bias in computer vision systems targeting both types of dataset shifts that I described. So in particular, imbalance leads to demographic bias. For example, face recognition models are found to perform poorer for darker females, which are typically underrepresented in the face datasets. Also, vision language models tend to associate doctors predominantly with males and nurses with females because the opposite side is also underrepresented. Spurious correlation, on the other hand, leads to shortcut bias, which allows the models to cheat through complex problems with using simple and spurious features. So while it's generally considered desirable to use context in machine learning or computer vision settings, I would argue that overfitting to these biases can cause the models to fail when tested outside of their training context. For example, classifying a skateboard without a person on it, or recognizing a cow on a beach instead of grass. So why is it so important to study bias? I would say that the problem of bias stands at the intersection of two important fields in AI. Responsible AI, which concerns the fairness of models with respect to demographic groups, and trustworthy AI, which seeks to build generalizable models that are robust to dataset shifts or spurious correlations. So what can be studied about biases in context of computer vision? In general, I'd say there are three levels of questions to ask. First, discovering what biases are present in a particular vision problem. Second, try to measure how much bias there is quantitatively. And third and last, building mitigation methods to remove the bias. So this chain of research can be applied to, in fact, both data set and model bias, and which I have both worked on. It's a snapshot of the works, and this will also be the outline of the talk today. So I will start from my earlier works on debasing video data sets and also video models or video representations. I had covered these from my qualifying exam, but we'll go through them again since they're very instrumental for the later works that follow. Next, I'll introduce some of my more recent work, one on debasing multimodal vision language models, specifically video language models, which is in a different perspective of architecture design. And now, while dataset and model biases are often studied as isolated problems, I would argue that they should not, because data and models are really interconnected and can influence each other in significant ways. So to this end, at the end of the talk, I will motivate for a new paradigm that we call holistic debasing, where we no longer treat dataset and model as individual problems, but as a system where they influence one another. This means that we can use models to fix biases in the data and use debased data to calibrate biases in the model. So I'll present some of our explorations under this paradigm in debasing vision language foundation models at the end. So let's get started then with debasing video data sets. So to understand bias in video datasets, we need to start from the classic task of video action recognition. This is really the foundation of video understanding and drives the evolution of video models in the past decade in a similar way to ImageNet's object classification for image representations. And not surprisingly, many datasets have been proposed on this task alone. So what makes video understanding different from image understanding? I would say it's temporal information. A video is more than just a set of static frames, but really a sequence of frames in the right chronological order. And so we expect that whatever video models we train should be able to make use of this piece of information. Unfortunately, it turns out that because of dataset bias, learning the dynamics from the videos can, in fact, be very hard, as I will show. Why? Take this mini example here. So I'm showing 5 snapshots from 5 videos and their corresponding actions. So can you match each video to the correct action class without watching the entire video? Should be fairly trivial because the frames I showed already contains all the information you need to discriminate between the actions. For example, there's only one video which contains a keyboard, so it must be typing. And there's only one which has a bike, so it's riding bike. So in this sense, we say that the data set, the mini data set I'm showing here is spatially biased because visual cues from static image frames already give away the correct action class. So if we train a model on this kind of data set, it can take shortcuts and infer the actions basically only by recognizing objects and scenes without ever understanding the temporal progression of the actions. So the quantitative question behind this is how significant is the bias, or to what extent do object, scene, or other spatial features imply our target action label? So we start by defining a measure of bias in the dataset. We call it representation bias because, as the name implies, it's evaluated with respect to a feature representation. So let psi here be a spurious feature representation that we want to measure the bias for. So in video action recognition, this could be scene features, object features, or any static features that are extracted from single frames without including any temporal information. So we define representation bias as a kind of a normalized mutual information between the spurious features psi of x and the ground truth label y. So the normalized mutual information is basically the mutual information between two variables divided by the entropy of label y. I will skip the math here, but essentially this bias we show is linearly related to the cross entropy risk that's achieved by an optimal classifier on top of the spurious feature psi of x. So this makes sense in practice. Lower risk by the classifier means that the classifier is more certain about the label y given psi of x, which means there's more information leakage from this spurious representation and hence a higher bias. So at first we started by evaluating how biased existing video action datasets are with respect to object, scene, and person-centric representations, all of which are CNN features extracted from single frames of video, by the way. So we made quite a few interesting findings in our paper, which is also in the thesis, which I won't enumerate here. But for example, we calculated the data set level bias by overall classification accuracy of that classifier on top of the spurious features. And we found that the most popular data sets at the time, such as UCF 101 and kinetics, also happen to have the highest amount of bias. We also calculated a class level bias and which visualizes how many classes in each dataset have the largest bias towards object, scene, or person representations. So you can see that in most datasets, especially UCF and kinetics again, the bias is pretty much dominated by ImageNet or object representations. So besides evaluating on the existing datasets, we also collected a new video action dataset called Diving 48 as a less spatially biased option for benchmarking video action recognition. So if you've just watched the diving in the Olympic Games, you may know that a dive, which is specified by a dive number like this, it depends on the combination of take off from the board, the number of twists and somersaults during the flight, as well as the entry position into the water. So this means that recognizing a dive like this requires a holistic understanding of the video on the temporal level, and then there is no scene or object biases that give away the answer. So we collected a dataset of 48 fine-grained dive classes that are defined by this prefix tree, depending on the components that I just described. And we showed empirically that it did have much lower bias than existing action datasets. So Diving 48 has been a popular choice of datasets for kind of benchmarking temporal modeling in video models since its release, and it's actually still relevant today in the world of large vision transformers, which is quite impressive. So constructing a new dataset is nice, but can we also fix biases of existing datasets in a post hoc manner? So we studied dataset resampling as a way to achieve this. If you consider this toy example of binary classification in a 2D space, where one of the two features, psi here, is considered irrelevant or spurious, so that we don't want our classifier to focus on. So if you look at the projection of the classes onto the psi axis, it's quite easy to separate the two classes using psi alone, which means the dataset, as we say, is biased towards psi. And the resulting classifier here is also kind of skewed towards psi. So, but what if we resample the dataset to prioritize these samples in this region that are kind of closer to the boundary? Then, as you see, after resampling, the two classes would become less separable using this irrelevant feature psi alone, and hence the bias would be lower. And if you compare before and after, you can see that the resulting classifier on the debiased dataset or the resampled dataset also relies less on the relevant feature of psi, where the optimal classifier would be kind of a horizontal line that only focuses on the relevant features. So we call this procedure representation bias removal, or repair in short. So how to implement this in practice? First, we assign to each example xi, yi a learnable weight parameter wi, which is the unnormalized probability of this sample of being selected. We then optimize, the goal is then to optimize the weights to minimize the reweighted bias, and which is formulated by reweighting the entropy terms in the bias formulation here. So this gives us the bias of the reweighted dataset dw. So if you may recall that I said measuring the bias itself, the bias definition is performed by optimizing a classifier theta on top of the spurious features psi. So when combining this bias measurement with bias minimization, the resulting formulation becomes an adversarial game between theta and w. I'll explain. So basically, using gradient descent to solve this bias minimization problem, the algorithm can alternate between two steps. The first step updates the classifier theta to minimize the cross-entropy risk and improve the bias measurement, while the second step updates the weights W to adjust the sample weights and reduce the bias of the reweighted data. So we tested repair on 3 action datasets, UCF 101, HMDV, and kinetics. We measured the bias of the resampled dataset as a function of dataset size in the plot. So as you can see, performing uniform sampling, as in the dashed lines, has very little effect on reducing the spatial bias because it does not change the underlying data distribution, which is the fundamental source of the bias. In comparison, our adversarial sampling or repair sampling in solid lines can reduce bias on all 3 datasets. And the gap between that and the uniform sampling is much larger when more samples are removed in the sampling process. So in the case of UCF 101, we see a 4 times bias reduction versus random sampling. So this bottom figure shows the weight distribution that's learned on each of the 3 data sets. We observe that videos that get larger weights are typically those that require the understanding of action dynamics, such as pushing, which can refer to a variety of actions in different contexts, compared to those with lower weights that are typically biased examples where the labels are given away by spatial cues, such as pull-ups. So now that we have a working algorithm for debiasing datasets, we also study if it can be used to improve model generalization across domains. So here's an important hypothesis that we put forward, which is that each dataset has their own spatial biases, while the action dynamics is kind of shared universally across domains. So models trained on the debiased datasets with respect to spatial features can learn more dynamics and hence more generalizable features. So we constructed a cross-domain generalization experiment where we pre-trained models on kinetics and then tested their accuracies on HMDB videos on the exact same action classes without any fine-tuning. So there are 12 common classes, but I'm showing just 3 examples of them here. So we also trained the models on resampled versions of kinetics and basically made a plot of generalization accuracy or AP as a function of bias in the training data. So you can see a clear negative correlation between the generalization on y-axis and bias on the x-axis, which means that the repaired versions of the data sets can, which have lower bias, can actually improve the generalization of video classifiers when trained on them. So as a recap, so far, we've seen that video action datasets are biased towards spatial representations. We propose to measure this representation bias using classification risk on top of the spatial representations. And we performed bias mitigation using adversarial data resampling, which in the end improves the cross-domain generalization of models. Okay, so far so good. Fixing data sets is cool, but what if someone cares more about the behavior of video models rather than the property of the data sets? So in the next part of the talk, I'll cover 2 works on bias mitigation from the model side, one on video classification and another on multimodal learning in videos. So we have seen that video datasets are biased towards spatial features. Now, can a video model also be spatially biased? And can fixing these spatial bias improve the generalization or transferability of video representations, as we've seen in that cross dataset experiment? So intuitively, we can say that a video model is spatially biased if it behaves like a spatial model, in the sense that it captures no temporal dynamics in the video. So we propose dynamic score as a way to evaluate this dynamicness of video representations. If you consider a video classifier F5, such as a 3D ConvNet, which consists of video representation phi and the classifier head theta, we say that F5 has no temporal dynamics if its output probabilities can be modeled perfectly by a spatial classifier F5S, such as a 2D ConvNet that's applied to each individual frame of the video without considering their order. So motivated by this, we define the dynamic score gamma of video model F5 as the kind of disagreement between F5 and its closest spatial model F5S. So this is measured using a distillation loss, such as a KL divergence. And intuitively, the dynamic score quantifies the amount of information that cannot be modeled in pure spatial manners, for example, using an image classifier. So how do we obtain this spatial model phi S? The dynamic score here implies, the formulation here implies a knowledge distillation process from the video model, which is the teacher, to the image classifier, which is a student. However, this procedure requires training a new model every time you want to evaluate the bias of a video model, which is computationally expensive. So we explored an approximation of that by reusing the video model and instead modulating its inputs in a way that removes the temporal information. More specifically, this can be done either by freezing the video clip at one particular frame or shuffling the video frames at random. This way, the output from this video model on the shuffled or frozen input would also encode no temporal dynamics of the original video. So, having defined the dynamic score gamma, which quantifies the spatial or temporal bias of models, we can use it as regularization during model training to learn more dynamic representations with an extra penalty term that's weighted by lambda. This leads to two objectives depending on the choice of the spatial model that I just discussed. When using knowledge distillation, the objective becomes a minimax game between the video model and the spatial student, where the student tries to mimic the video teacher through distillation, while the teacher tries to learn representations that cannot be distilled to the spatial student. And when using dynamic scoring by input modulation, the regularizing term here is basically a difference between the same model outputs for using original versus frozen or shuffled inputs. So we call this procedure dynamic representation learning, or DRL. So what benefits do dynamic representations give you? Again, we focused here on the transferability of the learned video representations under the assumption that dynamic representations are more transferable than spatial ones. So we first compared different DRL strategies based on the choices of the spatial model. We trained all the models on a subset of kinetics and linearly probed the learned representations on downstream data sets. So taking the HMDB results as an example, we find that distillation-based scoring in blue curves does not actually improve transfer accuracy. And it also, excuse me, it also fails to converge for larger weights lambda, which is probably due to the instability that's introduced in that minimax objective. In comparison, we find that frame shuffling in gray actually improves the transferability for smaller values of lambda in all three cases, but it also degrades quickly as the value of lambda increases. So in comparison to all these, we find that frame freezing the clips in green actually produce the most consistent improvements in terms of transfer accuracy compared to the baseline model, which is lambda equals 0. So expanding the experiments to full kinetics pre-training and evaluating the representations on a larger diversity of downstream tasks, we can see that compared to conventional pre-training on ImageNet or kinetics, DRL, which is our method, produces representations that transfer better to new data sets under both linear evaluation and fine-tuning settings. So when we fine-tune the pre-trained network, we see that specifically you have improvements on data sets where temporal dynamics matter, but not on UCF, which we have seen initially that have the largest spatial bias. So it tells you that the evaluation must also be unbiased, or otherwise you might not see the benefit from debiasing the model itself. So we also probed the video representations in a few shot setting on more temporal focused data sets such as something and gesture. And you can see that the improvement over standard kinetics training is even more substantial, where 5-shot accuracy, for example, on kinetics, on something is improved by about 3% and more than 8% on gesture. So the takeaways here is that first, video classifiers behave like spatial models. Second, we propose to measure dynamic scores through both distillation and input modulation. And third, dynamic training by optimizing these dynamic score actually improves the transferability of representations learned by the video models. Okay, so next I'll introduce some of my more recent work on debiasing multimodal vision language models. So up till now, we have been focusing on bias in video classification. However, as you may know, the world is moving very quickly towards multimodal models that integrate vision with language and more modalities. So the next important question I studied is, do multimodal datasets and models also suffer from these biases? And if so, how do you mitigate them? So a natural extension of video models into the multimodal paradigm is video language pre-training. So here, a large volume of paired video and text are used to pre-train a video language foundation model. This model is then adapted to various downstream tasks, from video text retrieval to video question answering. So in the previous slides, I have established that video action datasets and classifiers have a bias towards spatial representations. So is the same happening here for video language models? We did a quick experiment with text-to-video retrieval demo using one of the standard video language models called Frozen in Time, asking it to find videos of person opening and closing a door. So you can see that all the top retrieved videos contained doors that are basically spatially relevant to the queries. But the model really struggled to differentiate between the queries of opening versus closing the door, and returns very similar set of results regardless of the query. So this shows that the model fails to learn the temporal context of the videos, which is somewhat surprising since the model itself has dedicated temporal attention in its transformer backbone. And in fact, two independent studies in recent years also revealed that single frame training can match state-of-the-art models on standard video language benchmarks without using any temporal information. Our findings from the last slide corroborate these and confirm that video language datasets and models are indeed biased towards spatial representations. Now, what is causing the video language models to be spatially biased? In this case, we argue that the problem is more than having a biased data set alone. So we looked into the design of existing models and found some common patterns. First, all video language models are initialized from strong image pre-training, such as clip, or fine-tuned with additional image text data, such as COCO or conceptual captions, which means the models have a kind of a strong spatial prior from their pre-training data. And second, video language training uses a small number of frames that are sparsely sampled from the original input video, which may be tens of seconds or even minutes long. And in this process, it basically the sampling process, frame sampling process, retains very little temporal information. So you can say that the design and training protocol of video language models together impose an inductive bias towards spatial reasoning over temporal. And in this case, we argue that data set debiasing is not enough to overcome the bias. And instead, the cure has to be on the model design and training itself. So specifically, we would ideally prefer to have a model that's trained with video data alone, and also using longer clips that are densely sampled from the videos. So these may sound like simple technical changes and design choices, but there are many practical challenges in building and training models for longer clips like this. So first of all, the model capacity is limited, which means you have to inherently trade off between temporal modeling and spatial modeling. Second, the modeling costs for longer clips is, of course, higher, and this is especially true for transformer-based models, where the self-attention cost grows quadratically with the length of the input. Sorry. And finally, there's a diminishing returns effect in sampling frames more sparsely, because as you sample the frames twice as frequently, it does not give you 2 times the amount of semantic information, because video is inherently kind of a low pass signal. So what are the solutions to all of these? We argue that we need a generation of more efficient video language models. So to build towards an efficient model for longer clips, we start by noticing a natural sparsity in video text learning. So as this video text pair shows, visual concepts from the caption, for example, the person, the pillow, and the old chair, each of them take up small portions of the spatial temporal volume in the visual signal. And most of the background regions of the video are actually irrelevant to the text description. In other words, if we tokenize the video into a sequence of spatial temporal cubes, most of these visual tokens would actually be redundant for the task of video text learning. This means that a naive transformer encoder, which uses dense attention to compute the dot product between every pair of video tokens, can be very inefficient because it spends most of the resource on the context tokens and not the subject. So motivated by these, we propose a sparse video text transformer architecture, or SVIT, in order to harness the sparsity in video modeling. So to understand how this works, we represent video transformers as graph networks with vertices being the video tokens and edges as the self-attention pattern between video tokens. So this allows for two strategies for achieving sparsity. We can enforce node sparsity by pruning unnecessary vertices or video tokens throughout during the forward pass. And we can achieve edge sparsity by sparsifying the attention connections, which means asking each video token to only attend to a subset of other tokens instead of all of them. So we first tackle edge sparsity using a design that's inspired by the Big Bird text transformer, which has a block sparse pattern. So if you let Z denote the sequence of video tokens, where the first token in blue is a global token or a class token that aggregates information from the entire video. So we group the adjacent video tokens into blocks and then define three types of edges in our sparse attention pattern. So the global attention basically connects this class token or global token with all the other video tokens. The local attention connects each video token to other tokens from the same block or neighboring blocks. So this corresponds to these block diagonals in this adjacency matrix. And random attention here connects video tokens with sparsely sampled non-neighboring blocks to enable long-range information modeling. So this way, we have reduced the compute cost of self-attention from quadratic to linear because each video token only attends to a constant number of other tokens that does not grow with the length of the sequence. The problem here is that the sparse pattern is predefined and not adaptive to the input semantics. So we address this by introducing also the node sparsity through token pruning. So this is following the prior work of EVIT for image transformers, where we basically rank the importance of video tokens by their global attention weight. And if you recall, global attention is basically from the class token or the global token to the rest of video tokens. So once we have those attention weights, we can basically keep a certain any percentage of patches with the highest attention and discard the rest of tokens that are less important. So what's neat about this method is that it works for both unimodal pruning and cross-modal pruning, depending on whether this Z class comes from the video or text sequence. Now, by combining node and edge sparsity, we can finally build the sparse video text transformer as follows. So the model itself is a fusion encoder architecture, which has been proven effective in VLMs like Albev and follow-up works for videos. So concretely, it consists of separate transformer encoders for video and text modalities, as well as a multimodal encoder on top that utilizes cross attention, which is the second A here. So as you can see, we can incorporate edge sparsity to the self-attention block within the video encoder in pink. And we can also plug in a node sparsity into the video encoder after the self-attention, as well as into the multimodal fusion encoder after cross-attention to perform basically sparsification in multiple layers throughout the network. So, so far so good. We have reduced the modeling cost of video language models, but training on long videos is also inefficient. We found it difficult to let the model learn long-term dependencies before learning shorter ones. So to address this, we considered a training curriculum which increases the clip length progressively, which we term temporal sparse expansion. So the key is to trade off between the sparsity of modeling and the sparsity of frame sampling. So basically, as the diagram shows, we initialize from the dense model that is trained on shorter video clips that are sparsely sampled from the video. But gradually, as we make the frame sampling more dense and basically get clips with more frames, we make the modeling itself more sparse as we reduce the sparsity parameters, or rather increase the sparsity parameters that controls the sparsity of the transformer modeling. So in our experiments, this progressive curriculum actually turns out to make a significant improvement to the model when we expand to 8 and 16 frames. So going back to the initial question, does the sparse model help reduce spatial bias in video language learning? We tested this by a simple temporal probing experiment on a temporal heavy data set, which is something v2. So here we compare the model performance on text-to-video retrieval using both the original videos and a perturbed version with the video frame randomly shuffled to remove all the temporal information. So you can see that while dense transformer has very similar performance between the original and shuffled videos, our sparse transformer displays a much larger gap between the two, which means that the sparse model is relying more on temporal information for predicting this video to text correspondence, and is therefore less biased towards spatial appearances. So singularity here as a baseline is a pure spatial model, so it's not surprising that it produces the exact same retrieval results, regardless of the ordering of frames. So by the way, we also showed how node sparsity steps in SVIT helps identify redundant input tokens. So you can see that the token map produced by cross-modal attention in the fusion encoder is much cleaner and more accurate than using visual attention alone. So does SVIT perform better than dense transformer on longer clips? We performed a zero-shot evaluation by pre-training the models on the WebVid2M, which is a pre-training image video text data set with 2 million pairs, and evaluating on the demo for video retrieval. So we find that compared to dense transformers, which is blue, we find that edge and node sparsification in orange and green both reduce computation costs and memory costs without sacrificing downstream performance significantly. The difference is particularly large for longer clips, such as t equals 8 or 16 frames. And our model, by combining both forms of sparsity, achieves the best trade-off between efficiency and performance. So we also compared the downstream performance of SVIT to state-of-the-art video language models, most of which used auxiliary image text dataset for pre-training. So we can say that our SVIT model outperforms these strong baselines while using video text training alone. And the differences that we found is particularly large on temporal heavy datasets, such as those inspired by action recognition, including charades, something v2, and ActivityNet QA. So I have the full evaluation results in the paper and my thesis. So In this project, basically, we learned that video language models are spatially biased due to the inductive biases from their architecture and training protocols. We showed that these spatial biases can be mitigated by architecture design and training curriculum, and in the end improves the performance on downstream tasks that require temporal modeling. So in the last part of the talk, I will motivate for a new paradigm that we call holistic debiasing and show some of our initial explorations on debiasing vision language foundation models. So going back to the vision language pre-training setting, where we have a large corpora of image and text to pre-train vision language foundation models, there are many choices of them, which is then adapted to various vision language downstream tasks. So far I've been focusing on the spatial bias, which is a form of spurious correlation or shortcut bias in my previous works. But let's now turn towards the other type of bias that I introduced in the beginning of the talk, which is demographic bias. So just like other vision models that involve human subjects, VLMs also suffer from biases caused by imbalanced demographics in its training data. For example, models are shown to associate certain occupations like doctor or nurse overwhelmingly with one gender over the other. So this negatively affects the fairness of VLMs in tasks like classification, captioning, retrieval, even image synthesis. So mitigation methods for VLM bias have been studied in the recent years. However, not all of them, we would argue, are suitable for foundation models for two major reasons. First, many debiasing approaches are crafted for a specific task like image text matching or image captioning and cannot generalize across diverse tasks that a foundation model is capable of performing. Second, many methods require a predefined vocabulary of neutral concepts, such as occupations, in order to debias the model, and that method would not be guaranteed to generalize beyond these closed set concepts. So how can we move beyond these settings and towards task agnostic and open vocabulary debiasing? I would argue that the key, again, is the data, because the data unites multiple vision language tasks, since many tasks can be defined on the same image text corpora. This leads us to the paradigm of holistic debiasing, where we treat dataset bias and model bias as interconnected rather than isolated problems. So just like how model bias can be mitigated through its training data, dataset bias can also be addressed using smartly chosen models, including generative models. And in this particular project, we studied the possibility to debias VLMs using generated counterfactuals. So unlike in the previous work where we changed the model architecture and pre-training, this is not realistic for large foundation VLMs in a resource-limited setting, as it is in our lab. So instead, we focus on debiasing a pre-trained VLM with a small amount of adaptation data. And we already know that foundation models can be conveniently adapted to target domains using parameter-efficient tuning. However, this process also makes the model learn all the biases in the adaptation data, making the adapted model more biased or less fair compared to the original zero-shot model, despite having a higher performance. So our proposal here is to rebalance this adaptation dataset D by synthesizing counterfactuals, as I'll explain shortly, so we can get the best of both worlds between performance and fairness. So specifically, we aim to debias vision language data by synthesizing counterfactuals. Here we build on the notion of counterfactual fairness, which requires model output to be invariant to an intervention on the protected attributes, such as gender, as I'm showing in this example here. So we propose to perform this image text intervention in two steps. First, we edit the text, and then edit the image conditioned on the original and edited text. I will show both steps in action. So first, we prompt large language models or LLMs to perform a text intervention on the captions of an image using a handwritten prompt here. So this approach is naturally open vocabulary because it works for any caption and does not require a predefined dictionary for word replacements, for example. So this allows us to generate an intervened text which has the opposite gender from the original text while preserving all the rest of the context. So given the original and intervened text, we use diffusion-based image editing models to perform the second step, which is image intervention. So one popular editing model that we used is instruct pix-to-pix, although we also tried other models like inversion-based editing in our experiments. So we first, in the case of instruct pix-to-pix, we first prompt the LLM again to generate a short edit instruction from the caption pairs before and after, and then feed the image as well as the edit prompt to the instruct pix-to-pix model to perform editing. So these are a few examples generated by the instruct pix-to-pix model on the COCO dataset. So by the way, we did not fine-tune the whole the editing model and only use simple heuristics like clip scores to sample from multiple edits from the model as a way to reduce randomness. Okay, so once we have the mechanism for image text intervention, the debiased adaptation of VLMs essentially reduces to training with an augmented counterfactual loss. So we feed both the original and counterfactual examples to the VLM and use these use this combined loss to ensure that the model predicts both the original and the counterfactual data with high accuracy. So there are many benefits to this method. First, it requires no change to the model architecture, which we used blip in this work, by the way. And it does not need intermediate representations within the VLM as many other methods required. And most importantly, the same idea can be applied to all tasks involving paired image and text, such as retrieval and captioning, as long as your VLM supports them. So basically, all we need is the corresponding task loss without having to specialize our methods for each downstream task. So I will skip all the boring training details because it's really trivial and get straight to the results of debiasing. So I will show results on 3 tasks where we use counterfactual debiasing to improve model fairness. The first is image classification, where we used a SLAB-A dataset of face attributes. Some of these attributes, like blonde hair and wearing earrings, are highly correlated with one gender over another. So this is traditionally studied as an image task, but we can follow a clip-like prompting strategy to unlock zero-shot classification and few-shot adaptation with VLMs. So the goal here is to maximize the classification performance in predicting the attributes, while at the same time minimizing the gender bias, that is the performance between male and female groups for a given attribute. So the bias here is measured by disparity in equal opportunity and group accuracy gap, basically DO and accuracy gap here in this plot. So what we find is that, so we performed a few-shot adaptation on SLAB-A with 256 images per class. And we find that first, the naively adapted model, so both fine-tuning on the whole data set and adapting on 256 shots, are more biased than the original zero-shot blip measured by DO bias. So by the way, the biases are lower the better in both cases. So while the naive fine-tuning increases the bias, we find that training with counterfactuals significantly reduces both the equal opportunity and the group accuracy biases compared to naive training. So what's impressive is that this counterfactual training also maintains high performance of the standard fine-tuning or adaptation on the 256, the same 256 shot setting, which is comparable to full fine tuning and also much higher than the pre-trained or zero shot blip. So if we look at the biases for each facial attributes in SLAB A, we can find that the improvements or the bias reduction is almost universal with our method. And the bias reduction is particularly large for classes like bags under eyes, chubby blonde hair, wearing earrings, which so these attributes also happen to be the most gender biased attributes to start with. So the very same idea applies to image captioning, where we augmented the original language modeling objective with an extra loss on the counterfactual image text pairs. So in this case, we used COCO dataset for adaptation, and we only used 1% of the training set in this case, because again, we're interested more in a low resource adaptation setting. So again, we find that counterfactual debiasing here reduces the bias of captioning as measured by bias amplification and leakage metrics compared to naive adaptation. So notice that the conventional dataset debiasing methods, such as rebalancing the gender, does not achieve the same effect. It still has a high bias as compared to the original as compared to the naive adaptation, because balancing the gender does not decorrelate them from all the other concepts in the caption, such as doctor or nurse. So, and at the same time, we see that our method retains the downstream performance on both COCO and no caps, which is an out of distribution evaluation set, and gives better results than zero shot model. So these are a few qualitative examples to show that the debias model for captioning actually performs better than baseline models, which tends to make wrong gender associations in some of these images that we tried. So finally, we studied image text retrieval, which is slightly more complex because both the query set, which is the text, and the candidate set, which is the images, can include counterfactuals. So we had to modify the training objective slightly, which I won't get into the details, although the overall formulation with the augmented laws is more or less the same. So to evaluate the fairness on retrieval, we use the Fairface dataset, which contains faces with balanced demographics. Following the prior work, we used a set of neutral queries, such as a photo of a good or smart, attractive, criminal person, and evaluate the uniformity or skew of gender in the top K retrieved images. So a zero skew would mean that the model is retrieving male and female images equally, which is the desired behavior. So, sorry, you can see that compared to the baseline retrieval model, using counterfactual debiasing consistently lowers the max skew score, meaning that the gender is more balanced in the retrieval results. So we also observed an improved fairness for queries involving occupations such as doctor or nurse. As you can see, the ratio of the retrieved genders are closer to half-half split than the baseline using both queries. So one interesting finding we made here is that simply balancing the occurrence of each gender in the adaptation dataset not only doesn't help reducing the retrieval bias, but it actually augments them, leading to a more biased model than naive pre-training. While in comparison, our model trained with counterfactual debiasing can maintain the downstream performance while at the same time reduce the bias according to bias and max skew metrics in the literature. So beyond gender biases, we also experimented with racial bias and seam bias. I won't get into the details, but what we found is that while image text editing is definitely not flawless, it showed some impressive results in mitigating all kinds of different biases on different tasks. And it has a good potential, I think, to unify the study of bias and fairness in vision language learning. So as a recap to the talk today, I have covered, I started with studying dataset bias in video action recognition, where we quantified the biases and then proposed ways to reduce the biases with resampling. I then turned to addressing the model bias, where we proposed a way to increase the dynamicness learned by video models and show that it improves the model transferability. I also touched on the architecture design side of things and showed that sometimes bias can be mitigated by a better architecture and training curriculum. And finally, I turned into this holistic debiasing paradigm where we showed that we can use models to debias the data sets and then using the debiased data sets to calibrate for model biases. So what is next? I think the study I covered today is, especially the latter works, opens up new possibilities in unifying the biases across generative and discriminative models. And as you know, there are a heck of a lot of them nowadays. So between the vision, language, and label spaces, there's many families of discriminative and generative models that the biases of those, such as GPTs, lava, stable diffusion, detectors, segmentation models, class conditioned image generation. So the bias for all of them are very understudied today because it's difficult to come up with a unifying framework to understand these biases in relation to each other. So can we use one model to probe the bias of another model, or can we form a loop where the different models can correct the biases for each other? I think under these are all of these are interesting problems that arise under a holistic view of bias, and I'm really looking forward to more studies along these directions. So I would like to conclude the talk with a cartoon from the famous dataset bias paper from Professor Antonio and Alyosha 12 years ago, which kind of started everything in the field of bias in computer vision. And it's certainly shaped my view of bias in the field. So this was the kind of the four stages of dealing with bias that I think early researchers and practitioners had to face. And I think I'm glad that we have went through all four stages into, acknowledging that the bias is there and we need to continuously evolve our bias mitigation methods and so that bias mitigation keeps up with the development of new models in the future. So I think the field in general will have to kind of loop between having new models and then discovering new biases within these new models and then fixing these biases and then basically continue in the loop. And this is exactly in this way that we can make small steps towards responsible and trustworthy AI in the long run. Yeah, so that pretty much concludes my talk. I would like to express my thanks to, first and foremost, my advisor, Professor Nuno Vasconcelos, for all the guidance that he has given me over the years. And I would also like to thank everyone in my doctoral committee, Professor Nicolai, Trong, Xiaolong, and Zhuowen, for giving me all the valuable advices on my thesis research. I'd also like to thank all of my collaborators from both UCSD, my internship and beyond, and also many, many more friends, lab mates, and my family who have been supporting me all throughout my PhD journey. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions from the audience.
Okay. Thank you, Yi. So what we'll do is there are some audience members not on the committee, so we will start by asking whether there are any questions from the audience, the general audience. Once those questions are addressed, then we'll ask the audience to leave, and then the committee will ask some more questions, and then we'll reach a final decision. So, are there any questions from the audience? Speak now or stay silent forever. Okay, so I think there are no audience questions. So I'm going to ask then the audience to leave, and then we'll continue with the